Hello fellow Z community members. I'm making this video here for all of us because over the years I've had some issues with my headlights not aiming correctly, and I have been procrastinating on whether to realign the lights. Now, if you go online and you look at a variety of sources that tell you how to adjust your headlamps, most people will tell you that if you have the USDM headlamp unit, it cannot be adjusted except for the vertical and horizontal adjustments that are made on the actual base that holds the headlight unit itself. And I wanted to shatter the notion that the USDM headlight unit cannot be adjusted vertically and horizontally unless you're adjusting the actual metallic base that the headlamp unit is resting on. So what you see here is my 1990 300ZX Twin Turbo. The door jamb says it was built in April of 1989. It is slightly modified, has over 162,000 miles, and at this point in my life I drive it roughly 1,200 to 1,500 miles per year. And this is because I want to have a sense of occasion when I drive. And so I usually drive very, very early Saturday and Sunday mornings just to give it a sense of occasion. My daily driver is a Subaru. I love that car to death, but the sense of occasion you have when you get into a Z that's over 30 years old, and with friends of mine who have a similar modification set up like mine, this car pushes roughly 245 to 350 wheel horsepower tested at the dyno. So I'm very pleased with the car. It's a very fast car in my opinion. It's not fast like the new cars out today, but it's definitely not a very slow car, I can tell you that. And I enjoy very spirited driving, especially during the wee hours of the morning, right during early twilight and the 45 minutes before sunrise. But this is of course where the headlight issues come in. The low beams are pointing a little bit too low, and unfortunately that makes driving a little bit precarious. But more importantly, it's the high beams that really get on my nerves, because if you're driving on a very dark road and you turn on the high beams aim in a bizarre fashion almost up into the sky. The car I own is, I'm the third owner of the car, and so I do know the person who sold me the car said the car overheated once, and I'm not sure if that had somehow warped the housing in some way and caused the alignment to go off. But in any case, that's a moot point, because that was the past, and the here and now requires me to actually fix this problem. So I really wanted to demystify the whole process of aligning a USDM headlamp unit on the Z. For many years I've been trying to adjust the low beams and high beams by playing with the screws on the metal base of our headlights, of the headlight unit, and really the success rate for this was not good. I never managed to align it correctly. The low beams were pointing too low and the high beams were too high, and the positioning of the headlights was very weird. So you see here how the passenger side headlights are adjusted too high to compensate for the low pointing low beams. The driver's side headlights are similarly annoying in that the foam stripping is somewhat deformed, and it was time for me to ultimately do something, because the low beams on the driver's side were pointing much lower than the low beams on the passenger side. So I decided to order a pair of headlights from an eBay vendor, and when the box arrived I knew that something was not going to turn out the way I intended. What I found to be quite astounding was that these beautiful headlights were wrapped in very thin bubble wrap. And to be very honest with you, I am surprised that the glass covering the headlights, the glass of the headlights themselves, did not crack in any way. So I felt really relieved when I pulled out the pair of headlights and noticed that the glass was still intact. That was pretty astounding given how dilapidated the entire package looked. My cautious optimism was shattered when I pulled out the passenger side headlight unit, and as you can see, the contraptions that hold the headlights to the metal base, the pivot points, in other words, there are two pivot points, one on each side. Well, on the side closest to the nose panel, it cracked the plastic. The plastic was cracked. The pivot point was essentially useless. This was really pretty bad. And I sat there for about an hour to 2 hours thinking if this could be salvaged as a headlamp unit. And I spoke to some friends and they said it definitely could be. They took a look at it. And of course, the answer was JB Weld. I mean, I JB Weld that area like there was no tomorrow, and it really worked wonders. But the driver's side low beam area of the headlights, I mean, look at this. It was just in a sorry state. Essentially, the vendor was falsely advertising this product. The person said that it would be sent in a clean state, it would be cleaned up, it was in good condition. That's complete BS. If you look at some of the metal retaining brackets that hold the rubber washer onto the projector beams that shine the light through the unit, well, as you can see, these were bent. And after removing the glass housing and the actual projector units out of the headlight housing, I was looking at the cracks, and the driver's side was basically unsalvageable. This person tried to use wood chips as a means to fix the cracks by combining it with silicone, and it was so thickly applied that I could not even remove the metal contraption that was the pivot point to the side of the housing, and it was just basically glued on there in a very stubborn manner. I could have tried to fix this like the passenger side unit, but that wasn't going to work. So I opted to sadly give up on this particular driver's side headlight by turning it into a guinea pig for me to test my theory that the USDM headlight unit can indeed be adjusted beyond what the metal base adjustments are able to do, and that is to adjust it through the screws that have been glued by epoxy in the back of the headlight unit. Now, this cool guy on the internet named David, and you can see his URL at the top of the screen, provided his analysis of the USDM versus the JDM headlamp units, and I found this to be one of the better articles out there regarding how to re-aim your deformed headlight trajectories. And so he provided this particular diagram, which really piqued my interest. And you see the lines that go to the high beam vertical adjustment and low beam horizontal adjustments. Those are under the epoxy that I was referring to earlier, as are the top screws. Now, the top screws can be seen on the high beam section of this rear shot of the passenger side headlights. And those two top screws are also similarly under epoxy. Now, let me tell you right now that those two top screws are actually hinge pivots that allow the high beam to be adjusted vertically. That is, you can raise and lower it. But where I had an issue was that this diagram shows that the low beam screw under the epoxy, the low beam horizontal adjustment screw, can actually do more than just a horizontal adjustment. In fact, from my experience, it actually is for vertical adjustments, not necessarily horizontal. And I'll show you footage of this shortly. Before I do that, however, I do want to show you the repairs I made on the passenger side crack on the side of the headlight unit that holds one of the pivot points. I JB welded that sucker and it became bulletproof, I believe, I hope. Here's how it looks like after. I allowed this to cure not for 24 hours, I allowed it to cure for 48 hours. At the time this project was being undertaken, Los Angeles was going through a very serious heat wave. So I basically placed the sucker outside all night, and the next morning by 8 a.m., 9 a.m. it was 80 degrees. By noon it was 100. By 3 p.m. it was 105. And it just cured this sucker. I mean, look at that thing. Similarly, I did the same to the inside of the passenger headlamp unit, and I just slathered JB Weld on there and let it cure for about 48 hours in the heat wave that Los Angeles was going through around early September 2022. The screws under the bezel that connected to the plastic housing where the projector beams and reflectors are were cracked as well, and so I JB welded those suckers as well. And I let it cure for 48 hours in the LA heat wave, and so it was quite sturdy after that, and I screwed it back on fine. Again, I want to go back to David's diagram here because I want to make the connection that the Phillips screw under the epoxy that potentially adjusts horizontally the low beam is actually good for vertical adjustment. And again, I'll have footage of that in short order. I just want to approach this from a very systematic and patient pace so that people don't just jump into this and think they can do it in a day. In fact, one, again, I cannot reiterate this enough, has to be very patient in this entire process. And there were many steps I did not show because I assumed that YouTube videos would instruct you on how to do so, namely to remove the glass from the plastic housing unit by heating it with a heat gun, and a whole host of other steps which I think other YouTube videos will cover effectively. Now recall that the driver's side headlamp unit was completely destroyed, and I therefore turned it into a guinea pig for me to experiment on this theory that those Phillips screws can actually do some sort of adjustment to align your low beams and high beams along with the vertical and horizontal adjustments that are on the base of the USDM headlights. And so what I did was I took David's photograph and diagram and mirrored it on Windows Edit, and I relabeled things a little bit. And now you're looking at the driver's side headlight unit that was mirrored off what David had and relabeled slightly so that you can see how I tested my actual driver's side headlight unit so that I can prove this point that the adjustments do exist beyond the ones that are on the metal base, working with the pivot points on the left and right side of the headlight housing. Now I know that was a mouthful, but if you've contemplated this set of activities long enough, all of this is really important for you to just keep in mind. Now here you see the driver's side sacrificed unit with the top two screws that hold the hinge pivots of the high beam removed. Now, the lower screw of the high beam bulb section, as well as the lower screw for the low beams, cannot be removed, because if you look into the unit itself, you'll see that there are lock washers holding those two screws together. But the top two screws that have been removed are the screws that hold the high beam in their hinge pivots that allow the lower screw adjusting the high beam to therefore pivot the reflector. Thank you for listening to that. Here you see the low beam adjustment screws on the left and the high beam adjustment screws on the right. Now, unlike David's diagram, both of these adjust vertical positioning of the low beam and of the high beam, with the left attending to the low beam and the right attending to the high beam. Okay? Now, you're probably asking what was the labor involved in getting rid of the epoxy. Now, let me show you that. Again, a quick reminder, the unit I'm performing this drilling on to get rid of the epoxy so as to expose these screws was done on the driver's side. Why? Because I ordered a brand new one later on, and because I had experience working on the one that was sacrificed on the altar for our Z gods. the new driver's headlight unit, which comes from another vendor on eBay, was just super excellent. It was in great shape. So by the time I got to working on that driver's side, everything was just running quite smoothly. I used a Dremel drill, a cylindrical drill with cutoff at 3 millimeters, and it's really ideal because it can clean that perimeter area right outside the screw, but before the collar that rises above the screw to house where the epoxy was injected. The drilling process was a bit time consuming, and I really recommend you wear a mask for this. And if you use a wire brush later, you can really just bring out the metal. And after doing this, after cleaning it up with a metal brush and getting rid of all the residue, I just sprayed lithium grease, lithium lubrication onto a WD-40 lithium, and I let it soak overnight because I wanted these screws to be able to turn effectively. Here you see those screws showing themselves after the epoxy has been removed. Again, I let the lubrication soak into the screw housing overnight because I knew a lot of adjustments would be made in the following days. Now, once the screws at the top for the high beam area are removed, you get to see at the front the hinge pivots that it rests on, and that black oval piece at the bottom is what the adjustment screw for the high beam aiming of the reflector goes into. You can see the green circles representing where the hinge pivots are for the high beam, and therefore the high beam can be adjusted, and here's the corresponding image in the back of where those two screws are that connect the hinge pivots. Now, after removing the reflectors for the high beam, the low beam projector comes out very easily. I've seen some YouTubers actually try to take that out without removing the high beam reflector. I don't recommend that at all. I think you should remove the high beam reflector. It's a lot more work, but then when you pull out the low beam, it won't be making contact with the high beam reflector itself, and therefore you won't risk cracking some edges of the high beam reflector if it remained in place. Again, a repeat of the video that shows the reflector being pulled out. And once the reflector for the high beam is pulled out, the low beams come out very easily. There's 4 screws there. YouTube videos show it. You loosen those screws, and the adjustment screw doesn't hold on to the low beam projector unit very tightly, and you can just basically pull it off. Now you see how the plastic housing holding the high beam reflectors and the low beam projectors will look like with all the elements pulled out. Now, interestingly, if you look at the pivot points for the low beam projector, you notice that it's different from the pivot points of the high beam projector or the high beam reflectors, because the high beam reflectors rests off hinge pivots, while the low beam projector unit rests off ball and socket pivots. And so the slits that go vertically on both sides of the ball and socket pivots suggests to me that it's supposed to be able to move up and down. Although again, I have to warn all of you that adjustments made to this are very fine. You're not going to be able to turn this with recklessness. I mean, there are limitations to how much you can adjust up and down with both the high beam and the low beam projectors. Now, I've noticed, and you will see this in the video later on, that there is more effective movement in, surprisingly and fortunately, the low beam projector housing, possibly because of the ball and socket pivots, and there's less movement allowed for the adjustment of the reflectors for the high beam. But the red arrows, and this is significant, point to the screws that have lock washers on them, and these screws cannot be removed. And if you lubricate this or let it soak overnight with lithium grease, enough grease will get through the holes where the threading is at, and it will make it turn rather easily. Now, it won't turn butter smooth, but it will be a significant improvement to the options you have for adjusting your low and high beams beyond the pivot points offered to us on the metal base of the USDM headlight unit. Here you see me adjusting the vertical position of the low beam by turning the adjustment screws, the ones that have the lock nuts on them. And here you see me adjusting the high beam. This is a little bit more stubborn, and you have more limited movement with the adjustments you can make with the high beam units, but it does move. I then proceeded to lubricate and or grease all of the pivot points on the metal base of the headlamp unit. And here I'm showing you the passenger side base. And there are quite a few pivot points on this. I was quite fascinated with the amount of complexity that people engineer into this stuff. So I sprayed WD-40 there. I greased this section. I proceeded to also look at every threaded area and grease those areas. Now, there's a British gentleman on YouTube that says that if your gear inside that housing is cracked, you can get a replacement part from Tamiya. I ordered the Tamiya part. It does not work in the American gearing system, if there is even such a difference. But it does not work. I ordered a pack of it. I was ready to fix my gearing. But fortunately, the sacrificial unit that I had some intact gears, and one of the gears was cracked indeed, and I replaced it with the one that I sacrificed for this video. This is one of the pivot points on the passenger side housing. I lubricated and greased that. Here you see the bezel, and in its original color, it had this sort of, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, this sort of dark coffee brown color, and it just didn't look right. And so I decided to paint the projector cover light gray with the outer edge left as is, and the bezel itself will be painted satin black. I didn't want to go gloss black because gloss black is a temperamental color to kind of spray if you're not a pro. And there are always just these blotches that don't seem to be consistent with different parts of the areas you spray. So satin kind of got rid of that whole problem right there. And here you see the unit installed with the light gray painted onto the projector cover, and the satin black and I think the gray looks really good together, and the outer edging of the cylindrical cover is still left in that original brownish dark charcoal color, if you want to call it that. And now I test the old light beam pattern onto this a board that I drew some 1-foot squares on to see the height of them, and they were aligned at the right height, believe it or not, but something about the driver's side, the passenger side, I'm sorry, didn't seem to illuminate too correctly. I then tested the high beams, and as you can see, the high beams were much higher, so I marked those areas where the high beam pattern landed on the board. After placing my new headlight units onto the car, it was time to test the projection beams. And here you go. It looks pretty good, pretty consistent. I put new Sylvania light bulbs in there, and the high beams are quite aligned. I biased the high beam to point a little bit lower than the specs listed in our user's manual. I'd like to emphasize that at this point, upon putting in your headlight units back into the car and realigning it so that the low beams match each other and that the high beams match each other, and then the high beams and low beams matching each other in terms of height. Folks, I would like to say and emphasize that it takes tremendous amounts of patience to do this. This is not something, I guarantee it, this is not something you can do in an afternoon. This is something that takes quite a long time. You have to welcome the night, or you have to have a dark environment. And after showing you this footage where the board, which is broken up into square feet, shows where the projection beams are going, I actually went for a few night drives to test it. And so I drove my Z around a few times without the front bumper. I found some empty parking lots where I was able to fine-tune further the heights of each of the headlamp units, that is the driver's side and the passenger side. Note that by now the alignment of the high beam with the low beam is consistent on both sides of the car. And as such, when I was at these empty parking lots, I essentially was able to fine-tune it with very little fanfare. And this time, the fine-tuning was done by adjusting the conventional vertical adjustment and horizontal adjustment screws that the user manual prescribes. And the process was, of course, very easy. Moreover, I drove the car a few times to ascertain the height without relying on the headlight aiming tool for me, and it turned out to be absolutely awesome. I did not want to rely on the arithmetic of how many inches off the ground the light beam should be. I went by feel. My eyes are not the best, so I really wanted to cater the trajectory of the light beam to fit how I usually see the world at night. And it turned out to be really, really nice. So here you see the restored lamps on the car, and it's looking quite good in my opinion. I do not think I will ever undertake this project again. I do now have two headlights that I removed from my car before putting these on, and they're sitting there. Maybe I will sell it, maybe I will one day do something creative with it, but this process took forever. Again, I cannot emphasize the amount of patience needed, and there were many steps here that were not shown. Removing the bumper, I removed the shroud from my intercoolers, and I ended up putting on a new shroud. I bought some yellow light bulbs for the fog lights and all this other stuff, but the most important is I did not go through the pivotal steps of showing you how I removed the glass from the plastic housing of the headlamp unit. And I do recommend you use a heat gun rather than the oven, because the heat gun allows you to have more immediate control when you blow it atop the glass. And if you do heat the glass to soften the glue, make sure you're heating from the top of the glass so that the glass transmits the heat into the glue evenly. Don't point the heat gun directly at the plastic housing because it could warp the housing. And little things like that I did not show, and that has nothing to do with my negligence per se, but this is because some good YouTubers out there have already given you the steps, okay? But the demystification process is complete, and that is you can adjust the low beams and the high beam reflectors outside of the pivot points offered to us on the metal housing unit of the USDM headlights. And again, know that the high beam adjustments are more limited, whereas the low beams have a little bit more leeway. So please treat your Z with a lot of love, and enjoy this if you embark on undertaking this task. Thanks for watching.